All right, this is Harry from 8186 for the second time, second recording because I screwed up the first one. Always check that stuff. I think I dragged these, um, you know, points of reference in OBS to a different location by accident, didn't notice. Anyhow, a couple things to note. Assignment. There's an assignment due tomorrow, I'm pretty sure, if you're watching this today. On Thursday, it's due on Friday. Don't be late. There's a lab 2 that's due, and it's going to be next week. And it's going to be on the material that I'm teaching you today. So make sure you pay attention. That's why this lecture is kind of important. Midterm. So this midterm's coming up. We're gonna do a full review, but if you could guess, it's probably gonna be on assignment one material, and a little bit of this lab. In fact, it's probably gonna be very similar to assignment one plus lab two. Just so you know. I don't have the date yet, but it will be before reading week or whatever you call it, the break. So keep an eye. We'll talk about it next week when I get some more details. Let's see. Now because I've done this once, I'm like, did I say that already? I don't even know. Oh, well, you'll have to suffer a little bit, just like I will. Um, Today we're going to talk about Node. I know we've done a little bit of Node with React. It was like 2 weeks ago, but we're going to do a little bit of reminder, refresher of where that came from, and then one of my awesome drawings, and hopefully this becomes interesting. So let's see. So Node, if you haven't, I'm sure we spent a lot of time getting this running on all of your computers. So hopefully you have Node and npx and npm all installed. Reminder that Node is a JavaScript runtime environment, and it was invented in 2009 or around there by someone who like really knew JavaScript and they really knew other languages, and they were like, wow, why can't I just use JavaScript as a server language? And so they created Node, and they did this because they can use the V8 engine that is Google's the Google's open source JavaScript engine. So this is the engine that Chrome conforms to, and I think Brave and a couple other uh, web browsers, right? So any update that happens in V8 can also happen on Node relatively quickly. Node grew in huge popularity, and this is what we're using. Node has a package manager, npm, right? So npm.js or npmjs.com, and we're going to be using this module called Express. And modules are like libraries, the DLLs in the System32 folder, very similar kind of function. And this is code that someone wrote that allows us to write a server. So speaking of servers, let's draw a little my diagram. Right, here's my client, and here's my server over here. And interesting things about servers that people sometimes don't know. If you ran a server back in the early 2000s or late 90s, I guess I caught again the tail end of this. Running a web server was kind of difficult. You basically had to build a PC, right? Just like you build a gaming PC, you build a server PC, and you would take it physically to a data center. And we had one here, it was like Golden Triangle Data Center or something like this. I used to take the bus and with this server and down to these data centers and plug it into their backbone. And they were the only ones that had like permanent internet connections with permanent IP addresses that you could hook up your server to. And that's basically, how you used to do these servers. And then we got remote desktop. So we could, I could actually not have to physically leave my house. I could remote desktop into my computer at that service provider, which is still like, it was on dial up. So I had to dial into those computers, which is crazy. And then we got cloud servers. Now, these are interesting. You ever talk to your parents or grandparents or talk to anybody that doesn't know anything about computers, and they're like, well, my pictures are in the cloud, like, or they like point at the clouds. They obviously don't know what they're talking about because you can't just magically put stuff in the clouds. This was just a buzzword, cloud computing, and really just lets you. It's the same thing as remoting in. So today's servers, they usually lie in a server farm, and it kind of probably looks like something like this. Yeah, data center server farm. In fact, Conestoga College has a sample of this. I think it's on the third floor, around three G 6 or something. I think there's like a server rack um, sample in there. You should go check it out. But really, yeah, the like a server is a physical machine, doesn't matter where. So we're gonna have a server, which is your laptop or your PC, whatever you're working on, and we can put stuff on it: web server, data server, game server, right? And the way we access these servers is by their IP addresses. And if the IP address is an apartment building, then the port number is the apartment, right? So when my client makes a request to the server and it says, okay, I want port 80 or 443, then it will go to the web server. So this is unlike React. Um, we're not just going to be building a website. We're actually going to be building a server itself, or not the physical one, but the software server, right? So we're going to make a web server. And as usual, I'm going to do a demo instead of just reading from the notes. And I just opened up VS Code, opened up a new folder. I'm calling it week 5. Maybe it's week 6 now. Doesn't matter. But open up terminal and we'll go and create a new node project. Now this time, last time we did npm, I think it was install or create React. I can't remember the exact syntax, but this time we're doing it a little bit more specific. So npm initiate is what we want. So initiate is for initialize. We're going to make our own package.json file. And if you recall, the package.json file, JSON file, stores all of the node modules that we need to run our program. And in this case, we need the express module. But before we do that, obviously we need to make this file. So this is like npm initiate is actually just a console program that you could write yourself, knowing all of the stuff that you learned in um, 8146. You could write this, right? Because you know how to take input from a user, you know how to save to a file, and you know how to convert things to objects. So it's kind of cool. Whenever you're using programs, at least I do, I think, well, how could I write that? And like, this is how. Anyway, so this is prompting us package name. It's defaulting to week 5, which is fine by me. Version number 1.0, which is fine by me. Remember, version number, this is if you're launching your software and you make a bug fix, you would increase the version number, right? Because you want to make sure people have the latest version of your software. Description, you could put lab 2 or demo, whatever you want. I'll put demo for now. Entry point, by default it says index.js, but I'm going to call mine server.js because we're working on a server. Everything else keep pretty much the same. And when we're done, we should be left with this package.json file. Second thing we want to do, we want to install the express module. So we do npm install express. And you can see we add the dependencies express. And then we get a node modules folder, just like our system32 folder with all the DLLs. And here's the express module right here. Note that express module also has a package.json, and if you scroll through it, it has dependencies. So the developer for Express used some other developers' code, right? They used accepts, array, flat, and body parser. And if you scroll through this modules folder, you can see here are all the source code, right? So here's the stuff for accepts, and they have a package.json because they had used dependencies. And when you use npm install, it loops through all of your package.json and downloads all the dependencies. So that's kind of how we share the code with each other in an easy fashion. It's interesting. These types of projects, right, are typically they're done open source by a handful of developers, like 5, not even. Well, it'll always be 1. Starts with 1 typically, right? So they would have never had a website that had all of these modules. They probably just had npm which connects to something, and then that's why these command line things exist because they happened before the websites existed. Anyway, so one last thing we need to do is create that server.js file. This is where all the magic happens, where your code magic is going to happen, right? So we're going to create this server. So instead of reading, I'll create it. So I'm going to actually require, and we'll put this in quote, require the express module. And we do this by doing const express equals require express. Right, and this just imports the express library from the node modules folder. Then I'm going to instantiate the module. So I'm going to do const app. I'm just going to call it app. Some people might call it server. We'll call it app equals express. And there's no new here. I think I don't know, but I'm just going by the Express documentation, right? So this is how they tell you to do it. So there might be a new inside of the Express function, and then all I want to do is app.listen, and notice this app is our server, and Express, like even though I say we're writing this web server, like technically, um, you know what was I trying to say? Oh, Express does some of the heavy lifting for us. So it does a lot of requests monitoring and all the background networking and all of this kind of stuff. So really, this listen function is just a loop. So our web server is going to sit here waiting for things to happen, right? In a while loop. That's really what listen is. We do have to tell it what port to use. You'll see this very commonly used, 8080. And there's a couple, I have a theory, because every website is either port 80 or port 443, and 80 was the most common. I feel like developers were lazy, and you could do 8080 because you could type 80 twice. And the other thing is like, remember I told you that I would physically have to build a web server and take it somewhere. Well, my production web server and my development server would be on the same machine because I really didn't want to purchase two machines. So you had to change the ports for those development machines. Anyway, and the last thing is, I know this terminology might be weird today, but um, every port from 1024 and down all the way to 0 is considered a privileged port, meaning they if you want to run a port like 80 or 443, you typically need root or admin access to do so. So anything above 1024 is not considered privileged, and we can run it. So that's another reason to use 8080. But again, I think it's just out of being lazy. So we do have app.listen 8080. I'm going to add a few more things here because we're going to have to work with them. Um, Actually, it should look like this. And I'll come back and explain what this means in a minute. What am Oh, wait, no, that's wrong. What am I thinking? It's been a day. Console.log, server listening on 8080. So this should get us going. Wait for requests. And as you might have guessed, um, you know, this would run the server. I'm going to actually make this 8080 a constant because, if we ever did want to launch this site, we would want to have the ability to change the port real quick. I'll come back to what this means in a bit. But yeah, so 8080 HTTP port here and here. And in fact, I'm going to type in HTTP localhost and then the colon and then put the port in because when I run this in console.log, um, oops, what's going to happen is it becomes clickable. So when I run my server, I can just click on it here as opposed to opening it in the browser. This will open it for us. Oops. And then, so let's run the server. So we'll do node server.js. And you can see server listing on 8080. And I can click on it. And when I open it, I get this. Now it looks like there's a problem, right? It says cannot get slash, but this is okay. Means it's working. If you get something that looks like this, the site cannot be reached. It means it's not working. If you get the cannot get slash, then we are good. Well, what does this mean, really? Right? So our client is making a request to the web server. And I think we talked about it last class, but these are called GET requests. And there's a couple. There's GET, POST, PUT, DELETE, a few others. But the most ones we ever work with are GET and PUSH, or sorry, GET and POST. So this is a GET request. Just like if I was going to any website and I type in the URL, I'm saying, hey, I'd like to get this web page. And this is saying I can't get this slash, which typically stands for index or home. And if I did localhost about, you would see it says I cannot get slash about. And instinctively, because so far how you've probably been developing web pages and learning HTML, you would think that, okay, I'm going to create an index.html file, right? And then put hello world or whatever. And you go to refresh your page, but still says cannot get. Well, why does this happen? Well, again, if you recall, we've been making web pages kind of static. They call them static web pages, right? So I could double click on this HTML file. It would pop up in the window, but it's not being served in our server. And we noticed this when we're doing our React app because remember, you were able to use my IP address from my laptop to get the website I was on, right? Well, this time, um, our web server doesn't know what to do. And when we make this GET request, right? This GET request, oops, the server does stuff, right? Oops, right? Does stuff in here, and then hopefully it sends back something. But in our case, our server is just doing listening. It's not sending anything back. So we actually have to tell our server that, hey, I'd like to send something back when I get a GET request. So we do this by doing app.get, and then we can put this slash in here. So what we call these is we call these our routes, ROUTE, like a bus route. Some people say bus route, but it's bus route. And when I comment these, I usually go route, get, and then whatever the thing is that we're sending. So in my case, it's index or home. And you know that we don't actually type index in here. And I explained that kind of last class. So this is our index. And then I'm going to add some other code, which I'll come back and talk about. Looks like this. And for now, I'll do console.log hello world. And so this line here, I'm doing a get, and you may have heard me say request, right? So this REQ in our get is stands for request. And we can open this up, and because it's object-oriented programming, you can see all the objects or all what's inside of all the properties that are inside of this object. And this will contain the information that is being sent by the client, or aka the browser. We're not going to do too much with this. What one we do want to concentrate on is the response. So we're kind of creating what's going to happen when we send the response back to the user, right? So you got to keep in mind we're not sending an HTML file at all. The browser, or sorry, our server is actually saying, "Hey, I'm going to do some stuff, and then I'm going to send back whatever the programmer wants me to send back." In this case, I'm going to send back, and you can see res. And this is where the express comes in. So this res is express syntax, and rec it does that kind of work for us. So I'm going to say res.send hello response. And maybe we'll make this more specific. So this is route get index, and then we'll say hello response. So this console.log is actually server side. And this send is getting sent to the server or to the client. So when I save this file and note I have to restart the server because the last it's still sitting here listening on the old code. But I'm going to restart the server. And if I go over here to localhost 8080 and I refresh, I should get hello response, right? Which is this line of code. And notice over here it says route get index. Every time I refresh this page, it's going to say route get index. But remember, these two things could be, halfway across the world. This browser is sitting over here in client, and every time I click the refresh, it's this line, right, going to the server. Server says, "Oh yeah, I'd like to respond with that," and the programmer is saying send hello response. So these are called routes, and you may start noticing things, right? So when I go to CNN.com and I click on one of these, notice up here it says CNN.com 2024-02-8 politics. Well, that's a route, right? So they've programmed somewhere in their server a route that specifically says take a date, and then a keyword, and then whatever the thing is. They don't actually have index.html for every one of these. They're dynamically generated. So you're going to start noticing when you look at web pages and code, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I could probably do that. Or, this is how it actually works, which I think is kind of neat. So if I wanted to make a second route, say for about, right? Um, Same problem. Oops. Just run the server. Same issue. It says cannot get about. So I'll make another one called about. Change some of my code. Let's give say about and restart it. And there we go. Cool so far. But notice that we're just sending text back to the client. The client is stupid, really. I mean, it's not super stupid, but in this case, it's stupid. The web server is doing the hard work, and the client is kind of dumb, doing the just the parsing. But if you right click on this page and I go view page source, right, we get hello response about, but there's no HTML in here. Oh no, let's zoom it out again, which is not valid. We need to send HTML somehow. We're gonna, and one way of doing it, if I was a new developer, I'd think, okay, I'm gonna take my index page and I'm gonna put it into my res.send because we can put whatever we want in here, and then I'll make it of a string that I can send. I'll escape these characters, and I'll pause this so you don't suffer through me doing it. Right. So here's our response, and if I load the server again, refresh our page, you can see I have hello world, and now we have finally valid HTML. But this kind of sucks because imagine I had to do this for every page and convert my HTML into a string. But in reality, that's what's happening. Like we're taking HTML and converting a string, and that's what's being fed down this line to the client as a response. But this makes life very difficult. So Express allows us to do something better, and we are actually object oriented and in a paradigm called MVC. So we're going to make a views folder for our V. The server is kind of the controller. Um, So in the views, I'm going to create an index.html. Remember that HTML doesn't matter, right? Because we're going to read this file server side. The browser doesn't care or doesn't know at this point. So in here, we have a couple of options. We're going to say, I'm going to get rid of these console.logs. I figure you know how to do this now. I'm going to say, I'd like to get the file called index.html and then send it back to the server. Couple things with this. Hopefully you remember. Actually, let's do it this way. So we're gonna say we have our file in views slash index, or sorry, in views, right? And I want to grab this file and send it. So we have res.send, and there's also res.send file, and we can do, or we want to, pardon me, we want to send views and then index.html. So I'm going to run this code, and you'll see there will be an error. The error says path must be absolute or specify root to res.send file. So hopefully you remember the difference between absolute paths and relative paths. And this is a relative path, and um, what we want is an actual absolute path. So I'm going to take my absolute path for this project, which should be right here, and I'm going to paste it into my code. You see users, Harry Scanlon documents, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to restart the server. And if I do that, in fact, I didn't put an H1, so we'll do H1 home and refresh my page, and you can see everything is fine, right? So we have, wow, sorry. Hold on. Wow. Anyway, so you can see there's our source. Everything's good. The problem with this is that if I send this code somewhere else, like a server, a cloud server, its folder structure is not going to look like this. If you send me your project, my folder structure is not going to look like your folder structure. So this doesn't really work for us. So how do we do this? If we can't use relative paths and we can't use a hard-coded absolute path, what do? Node has a solution. There is something called path, and it's a library that we can include, which takes care of this for us. And it just does some of the background work to get the actual path that we need. And we can just do path.join and then the built-in dir name. And it looks like this. And this kind of solves our problem. So the reason we do this is to get the absolute path of our folder. So you need this in order to do this properly. Otherwise, you're just building something that would work on your own machine, which is not the goal. So same thing. Pretty neat, right? Was just answering a question. Sorry. So I paused and now I forgot what I was talking about. Oh, right. The one more thing. There's always one more thing, right? So, actually, maybe even two more things. So the one more thing is I would like to add an image to my homepage. So I do image src, and I always use like SpaceX. I like SpaceX stuff. I like Elon. I think he's cool. Um, I'm gonna grab a SpaceX image just off the internet, and save it. And here it's right here. So you're gonna rename it to SpaceX.jpg. Now, um, you may think that I would drop SpaceX into my views folder, and that in my index I could just use, you know, /views/SpaceX. But if I go back to my page and I launch it, you can see it's a broken file. Now, if you think about this, when we make a GET request to the web server, the first thing that the server does is it sends back or does whatever it needs to do, and then it sends back an index file or an HTML file. And then the client reads the HTML file and then it says, is there anything else I need from the server? And that HTML file will be like, yeah, I need CSS, I need images, whatever. And for every item that it needs, it does another GET request. So every one of these requests, so that we can show this, right? I mentioned this before. If you go to CNN, actually, we'll go over here, CNN.com, and then I open up the browser and go inspect, and then go network, refresh the page, and it goes forever, right? But the first page is CNN.com. They're the first request. Then our browser parses it and it says, okay, the second thing is this that I need to load is landingprog.js. And then the next one is this one, and so on and so on and so on until it gets to images, and then it starts loading images and so on and so forth. So these are all GET requests. And I just finished saying, we have to program our GET requests. So there is no GET request for SpaceX.jpg. So our server actually just says, the same thing as before. If I do /SpaceX.jpg, it says cannot get SpaceX.jpg. So let's make one. So we can do SpaceX.jpg, and I'm going to send the file from views and SpaceX.jpg. Right now, if I refresh my page, I should get the image, which I do. But this would be terrible because all those hundreds or even thousands of GET requests for each picture I would be expected to make a route for. And this is actually, I want to show you real quick. If this is called, the route's called SpaceX.jpg, and I send back SpaceX, but I don't have to do that. I can send back index.html, right? So now when I go to my browser and I type in SpaceX.jpg, I get the HTML for the page, but the URL says SpaceX.jpg. So what I really want to be clear about is that this URL, it doesn't matter what it is called, right? This says .jpg, but it's actually coming back as text. So this route determines what it is that we're getting. So I want to make that clear. Now, like I said, this is kind of a pain in the butt. There's got to be a way to fix this specifically for static objects like images or JPEG or the CSS or JavaScript. Right, so there's got to be an easier way, and there is, of course. So we're going to get rid of this route. We don't need that. And we're going to add something called a public folder. A static folder or public folder is, I guess, what we want to call. So we do this by creating a new folder. We're going to, in this case, we call it public, and we're going to tell Express that we want to use this. So we're going to say app.use. It's called middleware. Again, we'll circle back later, but just trust me for now. And it's static public. And this, it doesn't have to be called public. I could call it whatever I want. Doesn't matter as long as it matches, right? So it's going to be referenced to this folder over here, but we're going to call it public. And then I'm going to move my SpaceX.jpg into the public folder, right? And then I'm going to restart my server. And now if I go to localhost 8080 SpaceX, I get the picture. Now, why does this work? Well, basically anything inside of this folder is accessible to the outside world. And if I make a GET request to the web server and it's for index, in the background, this app.listen will go through our code and say, okay, is there a GET request for index? And in this case, it's yes, and then we send back the index file, or we do whatever we want, right? And then I type in, whatever, and it says cannot get whatever. So, well, the same process. I do a GET request for whatever. The server says no, it does not exist in here. But because we added this express .static, it's going to first check all of our routes for whatever, and then it's going to go to the public folder and check for whatever, right? And then if that doesn't happen, then we get the cannot get whatever. If I type in spacex.jpg, the first thing that it will do is it's going to check for a route called spacex.jpg, which we don't have, and then it's going to check for anything in the public folder called spacex.jpg, which we do have this time. And it's going to send that thing back to the browser directly. So now anything that we put in this folder can be accessed directly, which means also if I go to index.html and I put in SpaceX.jpg, notice I don't have the views directory because the views directory is not publicly accessed. Nothing in this program is other than the public folder. So if I change it to SpaceX, now I can get my SpaceX image. I'll just style this real quick, just 200 pics or something. Wait, what's the code again? Width, right? There we go. Right, so notice the SRC is SpaceX. I'm gonna add an actual images folder, and I'll also add a CSS folder. Maybe I'll add a JS folder, and I'm gonna put my SpaceX into the images folder. And then I have to go back here and change this, obviously, to images slash SpaceX. Otherwise, now SpaceX image is not in the root of the public folder. Cool, right? So this is how Express works. This is how you set up the websites for basic. Now, there's tons of plugins for Express that make this work, like templates um, and things like this. But now for the last thing, Express. It's pretty handy, pretty versatile, but it's used a lot for creating APIs as well. So we can actually send back JSON or object or literal objects back. And let's say, for example, I make this route called API/crypto, right? API/crypto. And I don't know, we have some kind of database, connect to the database of crypto stuff. And then we're going to send that back as an API call. Well, we can kind of mimic this if I do, let's see if I have a, hold on. Pardon me, see if I have a crypto, let's see, URL. Here's one. So here's one that is an API call. I'm going to use this one that's formatted better. I'm just going to take this, one of these items, and I'm going to make it, I'm going to pretend we connect to the database, but I'm just going to make a literal object, right? So here's our literal object. And then all I'm going to do, instead of send res.send file, I'm going to do send or res.json. And that will let me send back any kind of object that we want as a JSON file. And now if I refresh my server, I can do API/crypto, and I'll get back an API call. So this is where Express, can really help, because your React site will eventually connect to an API. And where do we do that? So, technically we have to have a web server running and an API server running if we're going to use a React site, which, we don't get too much into in this class, but this is kind of how it works. Anyway, hopefully this gets you started on the lab. It's pretty much everything up till the API. In here, it asks you to make a route, it asks you to make an images folder, it asks you to make a CSS folder, and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm gonna upload this to YouTube. You're already watching this on YouTube, so you guys have an awesome day.